The Virgin tried to flee, the auction block, until the Cowboy's bid sealed her destiny. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Dusty's Respite, a frontier town that had seen better days. The air hung thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and desperation. Men gathered in clusters outside the saloon, their weathered faces turned toward the makeshift wooden platform that had been hastily erected in the center of town. I stood on that platform, my pale face a stark contrast to the grimy faces leering up at me. My once fine calico dress hung in tatters, the blue fabric torn and stained from weeks of captivity. My hands trembled as I clutched the rough wooden post beside me, the only thing keeping me upright. At 20, I had already seen more cruelty than most would witness in a lifetime. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Gentlemen, feast your eyes on this prize, barked Marshal Jericho Kane, his voice a gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. His greasy black hair clung to his skull, and his yellowed teeth flashed as he grinned at the crowd. Fresh from back east, untouched and unspoiled, a rare flower in our desert wilderness. My stomach churned at his words. I had been traveling west to meet my father when he, a corrupt and ruthless man, had ambushed our wagon. He'd killed my father without a second thought, but he had kept me alive for this moment. This degradation. The crowd pressed closer, their eyes hungry and calculating. Some men spat tobacco juice into the dirt, while others passed bottles of rot-gut whiskey between them. Women watched from doorways and windows, some with pity in their eyes, others with the hardened indifference of those who had learned not to care about another's misfortune. Now, don't be shy, Jex Kane continued, grabbing my chin and forcing me to look up. Show them those pretty blue eyes, girl. I jerked my head away, earning a sharp slap across my face. The crowd laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made my skin crawl. I blinked back tears, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. She's spirited, ain't she? Jex Kane chuckled. That'll cost extra, boys. Who'll start the bidding at $50? I had heard stories of what happened to women sold at such auctions. Death would be a mercy compared to what awaited me. My mind raced, searching for any escape. The platform was surrounded, but perhaps if I could create a distraction. 75, shouted a portly man in a stained vest. 100, countered another, his breath reeking of alcohol even from several feet away. My eyes darted to the edge of the platform. Jex Kane had turned to acknowledge the bids, his grip on my arm loosening. This was my chance. Without thinking, I wrenched free and bolted toward the steps. "The girl's running," someone yelled. Chaos erupted. Men lunged forward, hands grasping at my dress, my hair, anything they could reach. I stumbled down the wooden steps, my bare feet hitting the hot dirt of the street. I could taste freedom for just a moment before rough hands seized my shoulders. "Not so fast, Missy," growled a bearded man, his fingers digging into my flesh. I struggled wildly, kicking and clawing, but more hands joined in, dragging me back toward the platform. The red dust swirled around us, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. The sun seemed to burn hotter, and the air grew thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and cheap liquor. "Thought you could make a fool of me." Jex Kane snarled as they hauled me back up the steps. He produced a leather strap from his belt and brought it down hard across my back. I couldn't hold back my cry of pain. The strap bit through the thin fabric of my dress, leaving a burning line across my skin. Tears finally spilled down my cheeks, mixing with the dust on my face. "Let that be a lesson," Jex Kane announced to the crowd. "This merchandise is going to the highest bidder, one way or another." He straightened his vest and cleared his throat. "Now, where were we? Yes, $100. I stood trembling, my back on fire, my hope extinguished. The crowd had grown larger during the commotion, drawn by the spectacle like vultures to carrion. I could see no sympathy in their faces now, only greed and anticipation. 150, called out a man with gold teeth. 200. Another voice joined in. The numbers climbed higher, Each bid was another nail in the coffin of my freedom. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the nightmare, but Jex Kane grabbed my hair and yanked my head back. "Open your eyes, girl. Let them see what they're buying." I obeyed, staring out at the sea of faces with a mixture of defiance and despair. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, making the scene look even more hellish. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, a mockery of civilization in this lawless place. $250, someone shouted from the back. $300 came in immediate response. My legs threatened to give out. I had heard stories of what happened to women sold at such auctions. Death would be a mercy compared to what awaited me. I thought of my father, safe in his grave back in the city, and envied him. The bidding continued, voices rising in competition. Jex Kane's eyes gleamed with avarice as the price climbed. I felt myself growing faint, the heat and terror combining to make my head spin. The platform seemed to sway beneath my feet. $500. The crowd fell silent at the astronomical sum. Even Jex Kane looked surprised. All heads turned to see who had made such an outrageous bid. But I couldn't bring myself to look. What did it matter which devil bought my soul? $500, Jex Kane repeated, his voice tinged with awe. Do I hear 550? No one spoke. The only sounds were the whistle of wind through the buildings and the distant neighing of horses. Going once, going twice. My heart hammered in my chest. Soon it would be over. Soon I would belong to someone, like a horse or a piece of furniture. The thought made my stomach rebel. Sold. Jex Kane's gavel came down with finality. The crowd began to murmur, parting to let the buyer through. I kept my eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath my feet, unable to face my fate. I heard bootsteps approaching, slow and measured, spurs jingling with each stride. "Here's your money," a voice said. It was deep and calm, lacking the leering tone I had expected. I heard the clink of coins and the rustle of bills. Jex Kane counted greedily, his fingers flying over the money. "It's all here," he confirmed. "She's yours, stranger." A hand touched my elbow, gentle but firm. I flinched, expecting pain, but none came. "Can you walk?" the voice asked. I finally looked up. The man before me was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical clothes of a working man. Dust covered his worn leather chaps and faded blue shirt. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around green eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. Dark hair showed beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. I nodded mutely, not trusting my voice. "Then let's go," he said simply as he led me down from the platform. I heard someone in the crowd whisper, "That's Silas Stone. He's a bounty hunter. Strange fellow. Keeps to himself, mostly." Another voice added, "What's he want with a girl like that?" I wondered the same thing, but I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to resist. As we made our way through the crowd, I noticed how men stepped aside for Silas Stone, some with respect, others with wariness. He helped me onto a sturdy brown mare tied to the hitching post, then mounted his own horse, a magnificent black stallion. Without a word, he turned and rode out of town, leading my horse by the reins as Dusty's respite fell away behind us. I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why?" Silas Stone glanced back at me, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Because no one deserves to be sold like cattle," he said, then faced forward again. I wrapped my arms around myself, wincing as the movement pulled at the welt on my back. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of orange and red, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. I didn't know what awaited me at this stranger's home, but for the first time in weeks, I dared to hope it might be something better than what I had left behind. As we rode into the gathering dusk, the words echoed in my mind like a prophecy. The Virgin tried to flee the auction block until the cowboy's bid made her his forever. The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with excitement and greed. I felt like a lamb surrounded by wolves, each man calculating how much flesh he could afford. The stench of their unwashed bodies mixed with tobacco smoke created a suffocating cloud around the platform. $325, bellowed a man with a scar running down his left cheek. And I'll throw in my silver pocket watch. Laughter rippled through the gathering. Someone else shouted an obscene suggestion about what could be done with such a purchase, causing more crude guffaws. My cheeks burned with shame, but I forced myself to remain standing, even as my knees threatened to buckle. $350, countered another voice. The bidder was a thin man in a dusty black coat, his eyes cold and calculating behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked at me the way a butcher might examine a side of beef. Tears streamed down my face now, cutting channels through the dust on my cheeks. I had tried so hard to be strong, to maintain some dignity in this nightmare, but the reality was crushing my spirit. These men didn't see me as human. To them, I was merely an object, a plaything to be bought and used. Jex Kane strutted across the platform like a rooster, basking in the attention. Gentlemen, surely this rare beauty is worth more than $350. Look at that skin, pale as cream, those delicate hands that have never known hard labor. This is quality merchandise. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, delicate hands that had never known hard labor. If only they knew. I had helped my father run his small shop since I could hold a needle. I attended our small garden, helped with bookkeeping, gathered supplies. I was no pampered princess, despite what these men might think. But none of that mattered now. $400. The new bid came from Marshal Kane's right-hand man, a cruel and opportunistic brute. His reputation was well known. Girls who fell into his clutches rarely lasted long before disappearing or turning up dead in an alley. My vision blurred. I swayed on my feet, the combination of heat, fear, and despair overwhelming me. The platform seemed to tilt beneath me, and I reached out blindly for support. "Steady now," Jex Kane hissed, grabbing my arm roughly. "Can't have you fainting before the sale's complete." The crowd laughed again, but there was an ugly edge to it now. Some men had begun pushing and shoving, jockeying for better positions. The atmosphere grew more volatile by the minute. $425, someone yelled. $450. The numbers climbed higher. Each bid was another stone added to the weight, crushing my heart. I thought of my father, waiting for me in California, probably wondering why I hadn't arrived. Would he ever learn what happened to me? Would he search? Or would he assume I had simply decided not to come? A commotion erupted near the back of the crowd. Two men had begun fighting over something, whether related to the auction or some other grievance. I couldn't tell. The distraction caused a ripple effect, with more men turning to watch the brawl. For a wild moment, I considered trying to run again, but where would I go? I had no money, no friends in this brutal town. My feet were bare and bloodied from my first attempt. Even if I escaped the immediate danger, I would likely die of thirst in the desert, or fall prey to bandits or wild animals. "Order! Order!" Jex Kane shouted, banging his gavel on a wooden crate. The auction continues. The fighters were pulled apart, and attention returned to the platform. I noticed some women watching from the windows of the brothel across the street. Their painted faces were masks of indifference, but I thought I caught a glimpse of sympathy in one woman's eyes before she turned away. Now then, we're at 450. Do I hear 500? The crowd had grown quiet again, but it was the quiet of anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I could feel their eyes on me, dozens of gazes stripping away what little dignity remained. $500. The voice came from behind the crowd, calm and steady. Everyone turned to look, and I heard several people gasp. The bidder stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. I watched him approach through tear-blurred eyes. Silas Stone moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. He wasn't the largest man there, nor the most heavily armed, but something about his presence made others step aside. $500. Jex Kane repeated, clearly shocked by both the amount and the bidder. "Mr. Stone, I didn't expect." "You heard my bid," Silas said quietly. His voice carried despite its low volume, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Well, do I hear 525? Jex Kane looked around hopefully, but no one spoke. Even his right-hand man remained silent, his face dark with anger. I studied my unexpected savior, though I dared not think of him as such. Not yet. Silas Stone's clothes marked him as a working man, not wealthy enough to throw around such sums carelessly. His face was unreadable, giving no hint of his intentions. "Going once," Jex Kane said reluctantly. He clearly hadn't expected the auction to end so quickly, or with this particular buyer. The crowd began to mutter among themselves. I caught fragments of conversation. "What's Stone want with a girl? Man's been a loner for years. Maybe he's finally lost his mind. Waste of good money, if you ask me." Going twice. My legs finally gave out. I sank to my knees on the platform, my dress pooling around me. The wood was rough against my skin, but I couldn't find the strength to stand. Everything felt surreal, as if I were watching someone else's life from a great distance. Sold to Silas Stone for $500. The gavel came down with finality. The sound echoed in my ears like a death knell. I belonged to someone now. The auction was over. But my ordeal was just beginning. Silas approached the platform, reaching into his vest. He pulled out a leather pouch and counted out the money, a combination of gold coins and paper bills that made Jex Kane's eyes gleam with avarice. The marshal counted it twice, running his fingers over each coin, as if to assure himself they were real. "It's all here," Jex Kane admitted, sounding almost disappointed. "She's yours, Stone. Though what you plan to do with her, that's my business," Silas said curtly. He turned to me, who still knelt on the platform. "Can you stand?" I tried, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The events of the past hour, the attempted escape, the beating, the soul-crushing auction, had drained me of all strength. Without another word, Silas stepped onto the platform and offered his hand. I stared at it for a moment, torn between my instinctive fear and the practical need to leave this place. Finally, I placed my trembling hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped me to my feet. When I swayed, he steadied me with a hand on my elbow. Unlike the grabbing, possessive touches of the other men, his contact was purely functional. "My horse is this way," he said. As we descended from the platform, the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some men looked envious, others contemptuous. A few seemed puzzled, as if trying to solve a riddle. The women watching from doorways and windows showed a range of emotions: pity, curiosity, and in some cases, a flicker of hope. I kept my eyes down as we walked through the crowd. I could feel the weight of their stares, hear their whispered speculations. My face burned with humiliation, and fresh tears threatened to fall. We reached the horses, and Silas helped me mount the mare. His hands on my waist were impersonal, and he looked away politely as I struggled to arrange my torn dress. Once I was settled, he mounted his own horse and took the mare's reins. As we rode out of Dusty's respite, I risked a glance back. The crowd was already dispersing, moving on to the next entertainment. The platform stood empty now, just rough wooden planks that would probably be torn down and used for firewood. By tomorrow, it would be as if the auction had never happened. But I would remember. I would carry this day with me forever. The leering faces, the cruel laughter, the way my humanity had been stripped away piece by piece until I was nothing but a price tag. I turned forward again, watching Silas Stone's broad back as he led us into the desert. I didn't know what awaited me at his home. I didn't know if I had merely traded one form of captivity for another. But as the cursed town fell away behind us, and the vast expanse of the frontier opened before us, I whispered the words that seemed to summarize my fate. The Virgin tried to flee the auction block until the cowboy's bid made her his forever. The desert swallowed my words, and we rode on in silence toward an uncertain future. The desert stretched endlessly before us, painted in shades of amber and rust by the setting sunday. I gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles, my body swaying with the mare's gentle gait. Every muscle ached, and the welt across my back burned like fire. But I remained silent. What was there to say to this stranger who now owned me? Silas Stone rode ahead, his posture relaxed but alert. Occasionally, he would glance back to ensure I was still following, but he offered no conversation. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of hooves on hard-packed earth and the whisper of wind through scattered sagebrush. As darkness began to fall, my exhaustion deepened. I had barely eaten in days, surviving on scraps my captors had thrown my way. The events at the auction had drained what little energy remained. My eyelids grew heavy, and I found myself nodding forward. "We'll stop here for the night," Silas announced suddenly, guiding us toward a cluster of large rocks that would provide shelter from the wind. I jerked awake, disoriented. I watched wearily as he dismounted and began gathering dried brush for a fire. His movements were efficient, practiced, clearly a man accustomed to life on the trail. "Can you get down on your own?" he asked without looking at me. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. I swung my leg over and slid to the ground, barely suppressing a cry as my bare feet hit the rocky soil. My legs trembled, and I had to lean against the mare for support. Silas glanced at my feet, frowning. "Why didn't you say you had no shoes?" "You didn't ask," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. He studied me for a moment, then returned to building the fire. Soon, orange flames danced in the gathering darkness, casting flickering shadows on the rocks around us. Silas retrieved supplies from his saddlebags, hardtack, dried beef, and a canteen of water. He held out the canteen to me. "Drink." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to maintain distance, to trust nothing this man offered, but thirst won out. I accepted the canteen with trembling hands and drank deeply, the cool water soothing my parched throat. "Slowly," Silas cautioned. "You'll make yourself sick." I forced myself to take smaller sips, watching him over the canteen. He had removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. In the firelight, I could see his face more clearly weathered, but not unkind, with a day's growth of stubble shadowing his jaw. "Eat." He offered me some hard tack and beef. My stomach growled loudly, betraying my hunger. I took the food, nibbling cautiously at first, then with increasing appetite as my body remembered what it was to be fed. We sat in silence on opposite sides of the fire. Silas seemed content with the quiet, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't read. I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to make myself small, invisible. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. The question startled me. Throughout my captivity and the auction, no one had asked. I had been girl or worse. "Isadora," I said softly. "Isadora Finch." He nodded. "Silas Stone, though you probably heard that already." "Why?" The word escaped before I could stop it. "Why? What? Why did you buy me?" I couldn't bring myself to say the word without flinching. "What do you want?" Silas poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Couldn't stand by and watch. Not again." "Again?" I wanted to ask more, but his tone discouraged questions. Instead, I asked, "Where are we going?" "My cabin, about 15 miles north of here. We'll reach it by tomorrow afternoon if we start early." "And then?" He looked at me across the fire, his green eyes unreadable. "Then you'll be safe. No one will hurt you there, but I'll belong to you." The words tasted bitter. Silas's jaw tightened. "You'll work for me. Yes, keep house, help with meals. In exchange, you'll have shelter, food, protection. But you won't be a prisoner." He paused. "When you've earned enough to pay back what I spent, you'll be free to leave if you choose." I stared at him, searching for the lie, the trap. Men didn't spend $500 out of kindness. And if I tried to leave now, on foot with no supplies, you wouldn't make it 5 miles before the desert claimed you. His tone was matter-of-fact, not threatening. "But I won't chain you up, if that's what you're asking." I hugged my knees tighter. Freedom to leave meant nothing if leaving meant death. Still, it was more than I had dared hope for. "What kind of work?" "Can you cook?" "Some. My mother taught me before. She died." "Sewing?" "Yes." "Then we'll manage." He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "There's a bedroll in my pack. Take it. Where will you sleep? I've slept on harder ground than this." He moved to tend the horses, giving me privacy to arrange the bedroll. I spread it near the fire, grateful for its warmth against the desert's nighttime chill. The blanket smelled of leather and horse, but it was clean. I lay down gingerly, mindful of my injured back. "That welt needs tending," Silas said, returning to the fire. "I have some salve in my pack." "No." The refusal came out sharper than intended. The thought of him touching me, even to help, made my skin crawl. He didn't argue, simply placed a small tin within my reach. "It's there if you change your mind." I watched him settle against a rock, his rifle across his knees. Despite his claim that I wasn't a prisoner, he positioned himself between me and the horses and freedom. "You should sleep," he said. "We have a long ride tomorrow." But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the leering faces from the auction, felt phantom hands grabbing at me. The desert sounds rustling creatures. Distant coyote howls kept me on edge. "Can't sleep?" Silas's voice was quiet in the darkness. "No. First night's always the hardest." "First night of what?" "Of whatever comes after the worst day of your life." I turned to look at him, surprised by the understanding in his tone. "You sound like you know." "I do." He shifted against the rock. 5 years ago, I lost my partner. Fever took him while I was on a bounty hunt. Came home to a lonely grave and a cabin full of ghosts. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. I felt an unexpected stirring of sympathy. "I'm sorry." So was I. Sorry enough to consider eating a bullet, but he wouldn't have wanted that. So I kept going. Some days are harder than others. "Is that why you helped me? Because of him?" Silas was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "He was a good man, saw something worth saving in a rough bounty hunter like me. Today, watching those men bid on you like livestock, I kept thinking about him. How he would have wanted someone to do something, how it would have killed him to see such cruelty." I felt tears prick my eyes. "He sounds like a good man." He was. Silas's voice grew gruff. "Get some sleep, Miss Finch. Tomorrow will be better than today. Has to be." This time, I found I could close my eyes without seeing the auction. Instead, I pictured a kind man who had seen good in a rough bounty hunter. As I drifted toward sleep, I wondered if I might find something worth saving in Silas Stone, too. The fire burned low, and the desert night wrapped around us like a blanket. In the distance, a lone owl called, its voice carrying across the vast emptiness. My breathing deepened into sleep, and Silas maintained his vigil, rifle ready, watching over me as he'd promised. When dawn broke across the desert, painting the rocks in shades of rose and gold, I woke to find Silas already up, preparing the horses. The salve tin sat beside my bedroll, and I realized my back no longer burned as fiercely. Somehow, while I slept, he had applied the medicine without waking me. "Ready to ride?" he asked, his tone neutral as always. I nodded, folding the bedroll carefully as I handed it back to him. Their fingers brushed briefly. I didn't flinch this time. We mounted up and continued north, the sun climbing higher behind us. The landscape began to change, harsh desert giving way to scattered grassland. In the distance, I could make out the dark shapes of mountains. Neither of us spoke of the night's conversation, but something had shifted between us. The weariness remained, but beneath it lay the fragile possibility of understanding. I still didn't know what awaited me at Silas Stone's cabin, but for the first time since my capture, I dared to hope it might be something other than misery. As we rode on through the morning light, I found myself thinking not of the auction block I'd fled, but of the promise Silas had made. Tomorrow will be better than today. It had to be. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The cabin appeared like a mirage in the afternoon heat, a modest wooden structure with a small porch, a barn weathered silver by the sun, and a small corral where 3 horses grazed. It wasn't grand, but after weeks of captivity and the horror of the auction, it looked like paradise to me. "Home," Silas said simply, dismounting near the barn. I slid from the mare, my legs stiff from the long ride. I stood uncertainly, unsure what came next. The cabin was isolated, the nearest neighbor probably miles away. If Silas had lied about his intentions, I would have no help here. "Come on," he said, leading the horses into the barn. "I'll show you the house." The interior was exactly what I'd expected from a loner's home, functional, but neglected. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs hung in corners, and dishes were stacked haphazardly by the sink. The main room served as both kitchen and living space, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led off to what I assumed were bedroom. "It needs work," Silas admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Haven't had much cause to keep it nice." I moved to the kitchen area, examining the cast-iron stove and the shelves lined with preserves and canned goods. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" Define proper. Despite everything, I felt a tiny smile tug at my lips, something that didn't come from a can or involve hard tack. "Been a while," he admitted. I opened a cupboard, finding flour, cornmeal, and other basics. "Do you have chickens? Eggs?" "Out back. Probably need feeding. I've been gone 3 days." I nodded, mentally cataloging what needed to be done. Focusing on practical tasks helped push away the darker thoughts lurking at the edges of my mind. "I'll need water for washing and cooking." "Pump's outside. I'll show you." He paused at the door. "Your room is through there." He pointed to one of the doors. It was a guest room. But he didn't finish the sentence. I understood. "Thank you." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the grassland. Someone had hung yellow curtains that still held their cheerful color despite the dust. "I'll let you settle in," Silas said from the doorway. "Take whatever time you need." After he left, I sat on the bed, overwhelmed by the strange turn my life had taken. Yesterday, I'd been on an auction block. Today, I stood in a stranger's cabin, preparing to cook for the man who'd bought me. The absurdity of it all threatened to unleash either laughter or tears. I chose neither. Instead, I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. First, water. The pump handle was stiff from disuse, but I managed to fill 2 buckets. I heated water on the stove and began the monumental task of cleaning the kitchen. As I worked, I found myself humming, something I hadn't done since before the attack on the wagon. By evening, the kitchen sparkled. I'd found eggs in the hen house, along with some vegetables struggling to survive in a neglected garden. Combined with flour and some salt pork from the pantry, I managed to create a simple but hearty meal. Silas came in as I was setting the table, stopping short at the transformation. I'd forgotten what it looked like clean. "It needed doing," I said, suddenly self-conscious. "I hope you don't mind." He shook his head. "It looks good, real good." We ate in awkward silence at first. I picked at my food, my appetite dampened by the strangeness of the situation. Silas seemed equally uncomfortable, as if he'd forgotten how to share a meal with another person. "This is excellent," he said finally, gesturing to his plate. "Haven't tasted anything this good since you've been eating alone." I finished quietly. He nodded. "The food, it's good." The admission hung between us, too honest for comfort. I rose to clear the dishes, needing movement to break the tension. "I'll do those," Silas said. "No." The word came out forcefully. At his surprised look, I softened my tone. "I mean, I need to earn my keep. You said I'd work for you. Let me work." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." As I washed dishes, Silas sat by the fireplace, cleaning his rifle. The domestic scene felt surreal after everything I'd endured. I found myself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd bought me with the one who'd eaten my cooking with such appreciation. "I need to go to town tomorrow," he said suddenly. "Get you some proper clothes and shoes. Can't have you working barefoot." "I don't need." "Yes, you do." His tone brooked no argument. "Make a list of anything else you need. Fabric for sewing, kitchen supplies, whatever." My hands stilled in the dishwater. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Silas looked up from his rifle. "Is it kindness to treat someone like a human being? If so, that says more about the world than it does about me." That night, I lay in the small bed, staring at the ceiling. My body ached from the day's work, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from accomplishment rather than abuse. Through the thin walls, I could hear Silas moving around in his room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Tomorrow, he would go to town, leaving me alone here. I could take a horse, try to run, but to where? I had no money, no family, except a father who might not even be looking for me. And despite everything, I believed Silas would keep his word about letting me earn my freedom properly. A coyote howled in the distance, and I shivered despite the warm night. The world outside these walls was cruel and dangerous. Here, at least, I had shelter and purpose, and perhaps, though I hardly dared think it, safety. The next morning brought new challenges. Silas showed me the routine of his life, from feeding the horses to collecting eggs and tending the small, struggling garden. His hands were patient as he demonstrated how to work the stubborn pump more easily, how to scatter feed for the chickens without getting pecked. "You don't have to do everything," he said as I struggled with a heavy water bucket. "I'm not expecting you to run the whole place." "I want to," I insisted, pride making me stubborn. "I'm not some delicate flower, despite what that awful man said at the—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Silas's face darkened. "He's a bastard who'll get what's coming to him someday. Don't give his words another thought." We worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds and checking the sad-looking vegetables. I found the repetitive task soothing, the dirt under my fingernails oddly satisfying. When Silas accidentally brushed against me, reaching for a tool, I managed not to flinch. "You're getting sunburned," he observed, noting my reddened arms. "There's a hat in the house that might fit." It was his partner's. I couldn't. He'd want it used, not gathering dust. His voice was firm but gentle. "Take it." That afternoon, wearing his partner's straw hat and working in the garden, I felt like I was inhabiting a ghost's life. But as the sun beat down and Silas worked quietly nearby, I realized it wasn't entirely unpleasant. The ghost of the man I never met seemed kind, welcoming even. When Silas left for town the next day, he paused at the door. "I'll be back before dark. Lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone. Are you expecting trouble?" "No, but I'd rather be careful. There's a loaded shotgun above the fireplace if you need it." My eyes widened. "You'd trust me with a gun? Why wouldn't I?" After he left, I stood in the empty house, freedom and fear warring in my chest. I could take the gun, take a horse, take whatever supplies I wanted. He'd given me the power to rob him blind or defend myself as needed. Instead, I locked the door and returned to my cleaning, attacking the rest of the house with determined energy. By the time Silas's wagon rumbled up the drive that evening, I had transformed the entire living space. He entered carrying packages, his eyes widening at the changes. "You've been busy." "I found your cleaning supplies," I admitted. "I hope that was all right." "It's fine." He set down the packages. "These are for you." Inside were 2 simple dresses, undergarments, sturdy boots, fabric for sewing, and various personal items. I fingered the material, overwhelmed. "This must have cost." "It needed doing," he said gruffly. "Can't have you wearing rags." As I tried on the boots, a perfect fit, I felt tears threaten. It had been so long since anyone had shown me such consideration. "Thank you," I whispered. "Just being practical," Silas muttered. But I caught him watching with something like satisfaction as I admired the new clothes. That evening, wearing one of the new dresses, I served dinner with more confidence. The dress was simple blue cotton, but after weeks in torn rags, it felt like the finest silk. "You look," Silas started, then cleared his throat. "The dress suits you." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "It's wonderful to feel clean again." "Human," he said quietly. "You were always human. Don't let anyone tell you different." As we ate, conversation came easier. Silas told me about his life, the challenges of working in this harsh land. I found myself asking questions, genuinely interested in this life so different from my own. When thunder rumbled in the distance, Silas looked out the window with satisfaction. Rain coming. "Good for the grass and the garden." "And the garden," I added. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. It transformed his weathered face, revealing the younger man beneath the grief and hardship. "You're already thinking like a rancher's wife." The words hung in the air as both of us realized what he'd said. My hand froze halfway to my water glass. Silas's smile faded, replaced by embarrassment. I meant that island. You're thinking like someone who lives on a ranch. Not. I understood, I said quickly, though my heart was racing. The moment passed, but something had shifted again. As rain began pattering against the windows, I cleared the dishes while Silas secured the shutters. We moved around each other with growing ease, as if we'd been sharing the space for months rather than days. Later, as I prepared for bed, I heard Silas's voice through the door. "Miss Finch, yes? I'm glad you're here. The house, it needed life again." I pressed my hand against the door, imagining him on the other side. "So did I admitted. I heard his footsteps move away and settled into bed as rain drummed on the roof. For the first time since the attack on the wagon, I felt something I'd thought lost forever. Hope for tomorrow. "Hey there. Friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." Word of Silas Stone's purchase spread through the territory like wildfire. In a land where gossip traveled faster than tumbleweeds, the story of the reclusive bounty hunter who'd paid $500 for a girl became the stuff of legend, growing more embellished with each telling. I first became aware of the rumors when Silas returned from a supply run with a grim expression and a split lip. "What happened?" I asked, abandoning the bread I'd been kneading. "Nothing important." He moved past me to the water basin. "Silas." I had started using his given name the week before, at his insistence. "Please." He sighed, dabbing at his lip with a wet cloth. Jex Kane and his boys were at the general store. "Had some things to say about our arrangement." My stomach clenched. "What kind of things?" "Nothing worth repeating." His jaw tightened. "I set them straight." "Is that how you set them straight? With your face?" Despite the situation, his lips twitched. "You should see the other fellow." But I found no humor in it. I'd been foolish to think our quiet life at the cabin could continue undisturbed. The outside world had long memories and cruel tongue. 2 days later, I understood the full weight of our situation. Silas had ridden out to check on his snares, leaving me to tend the garden. I was watering the tomatoes when the sound of approaching horses made me look up. 3 men sat at the edge of the property, making no move to come closer, but clearly watching me. I recognized one from the auction, a lean man with cold eyes who'd bid enthusiastically until Silas's offer ended the sale. "Morning, miss," the lean man called out, touching his hat mockingly. "Just wanted to see what $500 looks like in the daylight." My hand tightened on the water bucket. "You're on private property." "So, we are," he grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Stone know you're out here alone? Seems mighty careless, leaving such valuable property unguarded." "I'm not property," I said firmly, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "Receipt says otherwise," another man chimed in. We all saw money change hands. The third man, younger than the others, seemed uncomfortable. "Come on, Jed, we've had our look." But Jed, the lean man, wasn't finished. "Tell Stone we'll be back with a better offer." A man ought to share his good fortune with his neighbors. They rode off laughing, leaving me shaking with a combination of rage and fear. I abandoned the garden and retreated to the house, checking the locks on doors and windows. The shotgun above the fireplace seemed to watch me, a silent reminder of Silas's trust. When Silas returned at sunset, he found me sitting at the kitchen table, the gun laid across my lap. "What happened?" His voice was deadly calm as I recounted the visit. "Jed Hawkins." Silas's hands clenched into fists. Should have known he wouldn't let it go. "Will they come back?" "Probably." He moved to the window, scanning the darkening landscape. "But they're cowards at heart. They won't try anything unless they catch one of us alone again." "I won't be run off by the likes of them," I said fiercely. Silas turned to study me, taking in the determined set of my jaw, the steady way I handled the gun. "No, I don't believe you will." The next morning brought a new challenge. Mrs. Adelaide Pearson, the banker's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of the county, arrived in her fancy carriage with 2 other women from town. I answered the door, acutely aware of my simple dress and work-roughened hands compared to their fine clothing. "We've come to see how you're adjusting, Mrs. Pearson said, her tone making it clear this was an inspection, not a social call. "How kind," I replied, knowing I couldn't refuse them entry without causing more gossip. "Please come in." The women entered like a tribunal, their eyes cataloging every detail of the house. I served coffee with steady hands, grateful I'd baked fresh biscuits that morning. "Such a rustic home, Mrs. Pearson observed. You must find it quite different from your previous circumstances." "Yes," I agreed carefully, "but I'm grateful for it. Are you?" The woman's eyes glittered with malicious curiosity. "It must be difficult living here with Mr. Stone, unchaperoned." "I work for Mr. Stone," I said evenly. "I keep house and help with his work." "Of course you do," one of the other women murmured, exchanging meaningful looks with her companions. Mrs. Pearson leaned forward. "My dear, if you need assistance in leaving this situation, we could arrange." "I don't need assistance," I interrupted. "I'm exactly where I choose to be." The women left soon after, their disapproval hanging in the air like smoke. I knew they'd return to town with stories of the shameless girl living in sin with Silas Stone. Silas found me crying in the garden that evening, angrily pulling weeds as tears streamed down my face. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside me. "What's wrong?" "Those horrible women," I choked out. "They think that we're." "I know what they think." His voice was gentle. "Does it matter?" "Yes. No. I don't know." I sat back on my heels, wiping my face with dirty hands. "I've lost everything. My family, my reputation, my future. Now they want to take away the small peace I've found here." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I lost my partner, folks told me I should sell my cabin, move to town, start over. They meant well, but they didn't understand. This place, this life, it's who I am. Don't let anyone tell you who you are, Isadora. You know the truth." That night at dinner, I made a decision. "Teach me to shoot." Silas looked up from his plate. "The shotgun. Everything. Rifle, pistol, whatever you have. If men like Jed Hawkins are going to come around, I want to be ready. It's not easy." Neither was being sold on an auction block, but I survived that. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll start tomorrow." The lessons began at dawn. Silas was a patient teacher, correcting my stance, showing me how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. My first shots went wild, but I persisted with grim determination. "You're fighting the gun," Silas observed after another missed shot. "Relax. Let it be part of you." "Easy for you to say," I muttered, my shoulder already sore from the rifle's kick. "Here," he moved behind me, adjusting my hold. "Feel the difference." I was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his hands guiding mine. For a moment, I forgot about the target entirely. "Now," he said quietly, "breathe out slowly and squeeze." The shot hit the target dead center. I whooped with delight, turning to find Silas grinning at me. "I did it." "You did." His expression softened. "You're tougher than you look, Isadora Finch." "I've had to be." Our eyes held for a moment before Silas stepped back, clearing his throat. "Try again. Gotta make sure it wasn't luck." As the days passed, my shooting improved along with my confidence. I took to wearing one of Silas's old pistols when I worked outside, the weight of it comforting against my hip. The second confrontation with Jed Hawkins came on a market day. I had accompanied Silas to town for supplies, my first visit since the auction. I kept my head high despite the stares and whispers that followed us down Main Street. We were loading the wagon when Hawkins appeared with several cronies. Well, Stone brought his prize to town. Hawkins's grin was predatory. "Looking good, sweetheart. Cabin life agrees with you." "Move along, Jed," Silas warned. "Just being friendly." Hawkins stepped closer to me. "How about a drink at the saloon? I'll show you how a real man treats a lady." "No thank you," I said coolly. "I've seen how you treat ladies. I was there when you bid on me like I was cattle." Hawkins' face darkened. "Watch your tongue, girl. Stone won't always be around to protect you." "She doesn't need my protection," Silas said quietly. "Lady can take care of herself." As if to prove his point, my hand moved to the pistol at my hip. I didn't draw it, but the gesture wasn't lost on Hawkins. "You gave her a gun?" He laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's rich. What's next? Teaching her to read?" "I can already read," I said. "Also write and figure numbers. Can you?" Someone in the crowd snickered. Hawkins' face flushed red. "You've got a mouth on you. Someone ought to teach you manners." "Someone tried once. My voice was steel. I shot him. It was a lie. I'd never shot anyone. But Hawkins didn't know that. He backed up a step, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Come on, boys," he muttered. "Ain't worth our time." As they slunk away, Silas gave me an admiring look. "Remind me never to make you angry." "I'm shaking," I admitted quietly. "I know, but you didn't show it. That's what counts." The ride home was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. I felt something had shifted in town today. I was no longer just the girl from the auction. I was Isadora Finch, who could shoot straight and face down bullies. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Silas said, "You did well today." I was terrified. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about standing your ground anyway. He paused. "My partner. He would have liked you." It was the highest compliment he could give. I felt warmth bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Tell me about him," I said softly. So he did, sharing stories of the man who had captured his heart. As I listened, I began to understand the depth of his loss and the strength it had taken to save me that day at the auction. When he finally fell silent, I reached across the space between our chairs and touched his hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For giving me a chance at a life worth living." Silas turned his hand palm up, gently closing his fingers around mine. "You've given me the same." We sat that way as the fire burned low, hands linked, hearts beginning to open despite the odds against them. The drought came without warning. One day the sky was its usual endless blue, and the next it seemed to press down like a hot iron, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. The grass turned brown and brittle, crunching underfoot like autumn leaves in the middle of summer. I stood at the kitchen window, watching Silas inspect the nearly empty water barrels. His shoulders were tense with worry, though he tried to hide it when he came inside. "How bad is it?" I asked, setting a glass of our precious water before him. "Bad enough." He drank sparingly, I noticed. "If we don't find a new water source soon, we'll lose the horses." "Maybe worse." The garden I'd worked so hard to restore was already showing signs of distress. The tomatoes hung shriveled on their vines, and the corn stalks rattled like bones in the hot wind. Even the chickens seemed listless, seeking shade under the coop. "There must be something we can do," I said. Silas rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in every line. "Old Samuel Winters mentioned once that there might be a spring up in the northern hills. Never had cause to look for it before. Then we'll look for it now. It's a 2-day journey at least, through rough country. I can't leave you here alone that long. Not with Hawkins and his boys sniffing around. Then I'll come with you." Silas looked up sharply. "Isadora, it's dangerous. The heat alone is going to kill us slowly if we stay here doing nothing." I moved to sit across from him. "I'm not some delicate flower that wilts in the sun, Silas. You know that by now." He studied my face, seeing the determination there. Over the past weeks, I'd transformed from the terrified girl on the auction block into a capable partner. I could shoot straight, ride well, and had proven my courage more than once. "All right," he said finally. "We leave at first light." We spent the rest of the day preparing. I packed food that would keep in the heat hardtack, dried meat, precious water in every container we could spare. Silas checked our weapons and gathered rope, tools, anything that might help if we found water. That night, as I mended a tear in my riding skirt, Silas spread a worn map on the table. "Best guess is somewhere in this area." He pointed to a cluster of hills, marked with faded ink. Winters said his father found it once years ago, but couldn't remember the exact location. I leaned over to study the map, my shoulder brushing his. "What are these marks?" "Old mine shafts. Silver prospectors came through about 20 years back. Dug holes all over those hills before giving up. Could be dangerous. Everything out here is dangerous. I pointed out. He glanced at me. You can still change your mind. So can you. A smile tugged at his lips. Stubborn woman. Stubborn man. We set out before dawn, the stars still visible in the purple sky. I rode the mare I'd grown attached to while Silas led a pack mule loaded with supplies. The air was blessedly cool, but I knew it wouldn't last. By midday, the sun was a merciless forge overhead. The landscape shimmered with heat mirages, making distant rocks look like pools of water, cruel tricks of the light that mocked our thirst. "Drink," Silas ordered, passing me his canteen when he noticed my lips were cracked. "We need to conserve. Won't do us any good if you pass out from heat stroke. Drink." They rested during the hottest part of the day, in the shade of a large boulder, the animals panting beside them. I had never experienced such heat. It pressed against my skin like a living thing, sucking moisture from every pore. "Tell me about your home," Silas said suddenly. I looked at him in surprise. "What?" "Talk to me about green things. Water. Helps take your mind off the heat." So I did, describing the lush parks that turned gold in autumn, the river that ran behind my childhood home, the morning mist that rose from the valleys. Silas listened with his eyes closed, and I realized he was giving me a gift, a reason to remember beauty in this harsh place. As the sun began to sink, we resumed our journey. The hills rose before us, bare and forbidding. We made camp at the base, too exhausted to attempt climbing in the dark. My hands shook as I tried to start the evening fire. Silas noticed and gently took the flint from me. "You did well today," he said softly. "I feel like dried leather. You look beautiful." The words hung in the air between us. My heart skipped, but when I looked up, Silas was focused on the fire, his ears slightly red. That night, we lay in our bedrolls under a blanket of stars. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and I shivered despite my exhaustion. "Cold?" Silas asked. "A little." I heard him moving, and then his bedroll was beside mine, his warmth radiating across the small gap between us. "Better?" "Yes," I whispered. "Thank you, Isadora." His voice was quiet in the darkness. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I'm glad you're here. Not just for the help, but I'm glad." I reached out, finding his hand in the darkness. "So am I." We climbed at dawn, following what might have been an old game trail. The mule protested, but Silas coaxed it along with a patience I had come to admire. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, loose rocks that slid underfoot, narrow ledges that dropped away into darkness. "Watch that root," Silas called back. Just as my foot caught, I went down hard, my knee striking stone. Pain shot up my leg, and I bit back a cry. "Isadora!" Silas was beside me in an instant, his hands gentle as he examined my knee through the torn fabric. "Can you bend it?" I tried, wincing. "Yes, but it hurts. No breaks. That's good." He helped me sit against a rock, then surprised me by tearing a strip from his own shirt to bind the wound. "We should go back." "No." I gritted my teeth and stood. "We've come too far. I can manage. Your stubbornness is going to get you killed one day. Maybe, but not today." We pressed on, me limping but determined. The sun climbed higher, turning our search into a test of endurance. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, Silas froze. "Look." He pointed to a cluster of rocks ahead. Green. Sure enough, a small patch of vegetation clung to the hillside. Desert plants, but green ones. Where there was green, there might be water. We scrambled toward it, hope lending us energy. Silas dropped to his knees, digging frantically at the base of the plants. The soil was different here, darker and damp. He held up a handful of moist earth. "It's damp." We dug together, ignoring our bloodied fingers until Silas's hand broke through into emptiness. A small hole appeared, and with it, the beautiful sound of trickling water. "We found it," I breathed. "Silas, we found it." He pulled me into his arms, spinning me around despite our exhaustion. When he set me down, we were both laughing and crying at once. The spring was small but steady, feeding into a natural basin hidden behind the rocks. Silas tasted it carefully, then nodded. It's good. It's perfect. We drank deeply, let the animals drink, and refilled every container. Then, Silas set about marking the location, making notes, and taking landmarks so we could find it again. As I sat by the spring, letting the cool water soothe my injured knee, I watched Silas work. His face was animated with a hope I hadn't seen before. This water meant survival for them, for the cabin, for the life they were building together. We'll need to figure out how to transport larger quantities, he was saying, already planning. Maybe dig a channel or... Silas. He turned to me, and I smiled. We did it. We saved the cabin. We did. He came to sit beside me, his expression softening. Couldn't have done it without you. Couldn't have done it without you, either. We sat in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, watching the sun glint off our precious water. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the journey home, the work of bringing water to the cabin, the constant threat of men like Hawkins. But right now, in this moment, we had won a victory against the harsh land that tried to break us. Isadora. Silas's voice was thoughtful. Yes? That first day at the auction, I told you that you'd work for me until you earned your freedom. My heart sank a little. I remember. Well, I figure finding this spring more than pays your debt. You're free to go whenever you want. I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said, what if I don't want to go? Silas turned to look at me, hope flickering in his eyes. Then I'd say you're either crazy from the heat or the smartest woman I've ever met. Maybe both. I leaned my head against his shoulder. But this is home now, if you'll have me. His arm came around me, pulling me close. For as long as you want. We stayed by the spring until the worst heat passed. Then began the journey home. My knee ached, and we were both exhausted, but our spirits were high. We had water, we had hope, and increasingly, we had each other. As we descended from the hills, the cabin coming into view in the distance, I thought about the journey that had brought me here from the auction block to this moment. It had been a path of pain and fear, but also of discovery and unexpected joy. I love you, I said quietly, the words surprising me as much as him. Silas pulled his horse to a stop, staring at me. What did you say? I said I love you, Silas Stone. Despite everything, because of everything, I love you. He dismounted and helped me down, his hands shaking slightly. Isadora Finch, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You've brought me back to life. I love you, too. Under the vast desert sky, beside a mule loaded with precious water, we kissed for the first time. It was sweet and tentative, full of promise for the future we would build together. When we finally returned to the cabin, dusty and exhausted but triumphant, the sunset was painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The house stood waiting for us, no longer a refuge from the world, but a home, our home. The drought would continue for weeks more, but we would survive it. We had water, we had each other, and most importantly, we had chosen this life together, not because of a bill of sale or a desperate bid at an auction, but because of a cowboy love story forged in hardship and proven by trust. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The thunder of hoofbeats shattered the peaceful morning. I was hanging laundry when I saw the dust cloud approaching, too many riders moving too fast. My blood ran cold as I recognized the lead figure, Marshal Jericho Kane. Silas, I shouted, dropping the wet sheet and running for the house. He emerged from the barn, took one look at the approaching riders, and his face hardened. Get inside. Lock the doors. I'm not leaving you, Silas. Please. His eyes were urgent. Get the rifle. Watch from the window. I ran inside, my heart hammering as I grabbed the Winchester from above the fireplace. Through the window, I counted 8 men, all armed. They spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any escape route. Silas stood in the yard, his hand resting casually on his pistol. He looked calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Morning, Stone, Marshal Kane called out, dismounting with exaggerated ease. Fine day for a visit. State your business and get off my land, Jex. Now that's no way to treat neighbors. Marshal Kane's smile was predatory. We've come with a proposition, a generous one. Not interested. You haven't heard it yet? Marshal Kane gestured to his men, who remained mounted but ready. $500. That's what you paid for the girl. We'll give you $600. Make a profit and be done with this foolishness. My hands tightened on the rifle. They were trying to buy me again. She's not for sale, Silas said evenly. Everything's for sale, at the right price. Marshal Kane took a step closer. 700? That's more than most folks see in 2 years. You'd be a fool not to. I said she's not for sale. Now see, that's the problem. Marshal Kane's friendly tone vanished. You've got something doesn't belong to you. That girl should be working at the saloon, earning her keep proper-like, not playing house with some broken-down bounty hunter. Watch your tongue. Or what? Marshal Kane spread his arms wide. You'll take on 8 men for what? Some eastern piece who'll run off first chance she gets? I had heard enough. I stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. I'm not running anywhere. Several horses shied at my sudden appearance. The men reached for weapons, but my steady aim at Jex Kane kept them frozen. Well, Marshal Kane said, though his bravado seemed forced. Silas has been teaching you tricks. Get off our land, I said coldly. Our land? Marshal Kane laughed. You forget. Girl, property can't own property. You are property. I'm a free woman, mister. Silas released my debt. Any claim you think you have is meaningless. Is that so? One of Marshal Kane's men, a scarred brute named Butch, spat tobacco juice into the dust. Piece of paper don't mean nothing out here. Silas moved slightly, positioning himself better. It means something to me, and to any lawman worth his badge. Lawman? Marshal Kane scoffed. Nearest sheriff is 50 miles away. A lot can happen in 50 miles. The threat hung in the air like smoke. My finger hovered over the trigger, my pulse roaring in my ears. Here's what's going to happen, Silas said, his voice deadly calm. You're going to mount up and ride out. You're going to forget about Isadora. Forget about this cabin, and find other entertainment. Because if you don't, what? You'll shoot us all? Butch laughed. Even if you could, more would come. We got friends, Stone, lots of friends who think you've gotten too high and mighty. Maybe, Silas agreed, but you'll be too dead to see it. The standoff stretched taut, dust swirled in the morning heat. Somewhere a hawk cried overhead. I kept my rifle trained on Marshal Kane, though my arms were beginning to ache. Then one of the younger riders shifted nervously, his horse dancing sideways. The movement broke the spell. Boss, he said uncertainly. Maybe we should. Shut up, Tommy. But Marshal Kane was already calculating odds. Silas Stone had a reputation as a fast draw, and the girl had proven she could shoot. Even if they won, some of his men would die. Is one woman worth it? This isn't over, Marshal Kane said finally. Yes, it is. Silas's hand moved to his gun. You come here again, I'll kill you. That's not a threat, Jex. That's a promise. Marshal Kane's face flushed dark red. For a moment, I thought he might draw anyway. Then he turned abruptly and mounted his horse. Let's go, he snarled at his men. They rode out slowly, making a show of not being run off. I kept the rifle raised until they were dust specks on the horizon. Only then did I lower the weapon, my arms trembling. Silas was beside me instantly. You all right? They'll be back, I said, my voice shaky. You know they will. Maybe. He gently took the rifle from my hands. But you were magnificent. Scared them good. I was terrified. So was I. He pulled me into his arms, and I could feel his heart racing. When I saw all those men, thought about what they might do, I clung to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. We can't fight them all, Silas. Not if they keep coming. We won't be alone. He pulled back to look at me. Tom Bradley owes me favors. So does Jim Martinez. Good men who won't stand for Kane's kind of trouble. But even as he spoke, we both knew the truth. In this lawless land, might often made right. We'd won today through bluff and backbone, but Jex Kane wouldn't be deterred so easily. That night we took turns keeping watch. I dozed fitfully in a chair by the window, starting at every sound. Near dawn, Silas touched my shoulder. My turn. No need. Sun's coming up. He handed me coffee, strong and black. "We need to talk." My stomach clenched. "If you're going to send me away—" "Never." The word was fierce. "But we need to be smart. Kane was right about one thing. Without legal standing, you're vulnerable." "What are you saying?" Silas sat down his cup, took my hands. "Marry me." My breath caught. "What?" Not just for protection." His words came in a rush. "I love you, Isadora. Have for weeks now. But if you're my wife, legal and proper, Kane has no claim. No one does. Silas." My eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure? Your partner. He would want me to be happy, would want me to protect the woman I love." His hands tightened on mine. "I'm not asking you to replace him. I'm asking you to build something new with me, something ours." I thought about the journey that had brought us together. The auction block seemed a lifetime ago. In its place was this man who'd shown me kindness when the world had none to give, who taught me strength I didn't know I possessed. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." His kiss was tender, full of promise and relief. When we broke apart, both were smiling through tears. "We'll ride to town today," Silas said. "Find the preacher. Make it official. Kane won't like it. Kane can go to hell." We set out at midday, both armed, alert for trouble. The ride to town was tense, but we encountered no one. Word of the morning's confrontation had spread, however. People stared as we rode down Main Street, whispers following in our wake. Reverend Mills was in his small church, preparing Sunday's sermon. He looked up in surprise as we entered. "Mr. Stone, miss." He trailed off, clearly unsure how to address me. "Finch," I supplied, but hopefully not for much longer. Understanding dawned on the Reverend's weathered face. "You wish to be married?" Silas said. "Today, if possible. We can pay." The Reverend hesitated, and my heart sank. Even here, in God's house, I was marked by my past. "Reverend," Silas's voice hardened, "the lady and I wish to be married. Will you perform the ceremony or not?" "Of course." The Reverend straightened. "Of course I will. Let me fetch my wife and daughter as witnesses." The ceremony was simple but perfect. I wore my best dress, one of the two Silas had bought me, and held wildflowers he had picked on the ride. When Reverend Mills pronounced us husband and wife, I felt something shift inside me, like a door closing on the past and opening to the future. We emerged from the church to find a crowd gathered. Some faces showed disapproval, but others, particularly among the women, showed something like admiration. "Congratulations, Mrs. Stone," called out Mrs. Eliza Chen, who ran the boarding house. About time Silas found happiness again. Not everyone was pleased. Marshal Kane and several of his men stood across the street, watching with dark expressions. "This changes nothing," Marshal Kane called out. "A piece of paper don't make her respectable." "No," Silas agreed, his arm around my waist. "But it makes her mine, legal and binding. Any man who threatens my wife threatens me and me." I turned to see Tom Bradley, Silas's friend, stepping out of the general store. He was followed by Jim Martinez and several other hunters. "Heard there was trouble at your place this morning, Silas," Bradley said, his hand resting on his gun. "Figured you might need some backup." "Appreciate it, Tom." The men formed a loose line behind Silas and me. The message was clear. The Stones were not alone. Marshal Kane's face twisted with rage, but he was outnumbered now. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is," I said, stepping forward. "You lost, Mr. Kane. I'm not property. I'm not for sale. I'm Silas Stone's wife. And if you or your men come near our cabin again, you'll answer to all of us." For a moment, violence trembled in the air. Then Marshal Kane turned sharply and stalked away, his men trailing behind. The crowd began to disperse, several people offering congratulations. I accepted them graciously, though my knees felt weak with relief. That night, back at the cabin, I stood in what was now truly my home. Silas came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "No regrets?" he asked softly. I turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd saved me in every way a person could be saved. "None. only that I didn't meet you sooner." He kissed me as the sun set over our land, painting the sky in shades of hope. The threat of Marshal Kane lingered like a shadow, but it had lost its power to terrify. I was no longer alone, no longer vulnerable. I was Isadora Stone now, with a husband who loved me, friends who supported us, and a future worth fighting for. The girl on the auction block was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found strength in survival and love in the most unexpected place. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, I thought I heard a whispered blessing on the wind, or perhaps it was just my imagination. Either way, I felt at peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, I was home. The wound had festered for 3 days before I noticed Silas favoring his left side. He'd hidden it well, continuing his work around the cabin as if nothing had happened. But wives notice things that others miss. "Let me see," I demanded over breakfast, having caught him wincing as he reached for his coffee. "It's nothing." "Silas Stone, you show me right now or You'll what?" Despite his pain, his eyes held amusement. "I'll shoot you myself for being stubborn." He sighed and unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a ragged gash along his ribs, angry red and seeping. I gasped. "When did this happen?" "A few days back. Caught it on some barbed wire fixing the fence." "Barbed wire doesn't make cuts like that." My eyes narrowed. "This is from a knife." Silas's silence was admission enough. "Kane's men?" "2 of them jumped me near the eastern pasture. I ran them off." "And you didn't think to mention someone tried to kill you?" "Didn't try very hard or I'd be dead." He hissed as I cleaned the wound. "Didn't want to worry you. Too late for that." Tears stung my eyes as I worked. The cut was deep, already showing signs of infection. "This needs a doctor. Doc Harrington is 30 miles away." "Then we leave now, Silas." No arguments. My voice was steel. "I won't lose you to pride." We made the journey in record time, me driving the wagon while Silas lay in the back, fevered and delirious. I'd never been so frightened, not even on the auction block. Losing Silas now, after everything we'd survived, was unthinkable. Doc Harrington, a gruff man with gentle hands, cleaned and stitched the wound. "You're lucky," he told me. Another day, and the blood poisoning might have killed him. I stayed by Silas's bedside in the doctor's spare room, cooling his fever with damp cloths, whispering prayers and promises. On the second night, his fever broke. "Isadora." His voice was weak but lucid. "I'm here." I grasped his hand, tears of relief streaming down my face. "Did you really threaten to shoot me? And I will if you ever hide something like this again." He squeezed my hand weakly. "I love you too." We stayed another 3 days while Silas regained his strength. Word of the attack spread, and several hunters stopped by to express their outrage. An unspoken code had been broken. Disputes were one thing, but attempted murder was another. "This has gone too far," Tom Bradley said grimly. "Time to deal with Kane permanently." "No vigilante justice," Silas insisted from his bed. "We do this legal, or not at all." "Then what do you suggest?" "Federal marshal. There's one in Tucson. If we present evidence of Kane's crimes, the attempted murder, the harassment, the threats, he'll have to act." It was a slim hope, but better than starting a range war. Bradley agreed to make the journey to Tucson, while Silas recovered. On our 5th day at Doc Harrington's, I woke to find Silas's bed empty. Panic seized me until I spotted him through the window, standing in the small garden. I hurried outside. "You should be resting." "Needed air." He pulled me close with his good arm, and needed this. We stood together in the morning light, surrounded by the doctor's herbs and vegetables. It was peaceful here, safe, and for a moment, I wished we could stay forever. "I've been thinking," Silas said quietly. "Maybe we should sell. Start fresh somewhere else, where nobody knows our story." I pulled back to look at him. "Is that what you want?" "I want you safe. If that means leaving, no." The word came out fiercer than intended. "That's our home, Silas. Our land. I won't be driven off by cowards and thugs. Even if staying means more violence, more danger. We've faced worse and survived." I touched his face gently. "Besides, your partner loved that cabin. So do I. We're not giving up." Silas studied me for a long moment, then smiled. "When did you get so tough, Isadora Stone?" "The day you bought my freedom and gave me something worth fighting for." We returned home to find the cabin intact, watched over by Jim Martinez and his son. But tension hung thick in the air. Everyone was waiting for Kane's next move. It came 2 weeks later, not with guns, but with paper. "What is it?" I asked, seeing Silas's face darken as he read the document a nervous young man had delivered. "A lawsuit. Kane is claiming the auction was invalid. That you're still technically property of the traitors who captured you." Silas's hands clenched, crumpling the paper. "He's demanding you be returned to settle the debt." I felt ice in my veins. "Can he do that?" "He can try. He's got a lawyer from back east, some snake named Piton, who specializes in this kind of thing." "What do we do?" Silas's jaw set with determination. "We fight, and we win." The legal battle was unlike anything I had experienced. Piton was slick, presenting documents and testimonies that painted me as escaped property. The local judge, brought in from the territorial capital, listened with a face carved from stone. I was forced to relive my capture, the auction, every humiliating detail. Piton twisted my words, trying to make my marriage to Silas seem like another transaction. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Stone," Piton said smoothly, "that your husband paid for you? That money changed hands?" "He paid to free me from slavery," I said firmly, "not to own me. But he did pay, and you did go with him. How is that different from any other purchase?" I looked at Silas, drawing strength from his steady gaze. "Because he gave me a choice. Every day since, he's given me a choice. I chose to stay. I chose to marry him. I choose to be here now, fighting for my freedom and my home." The judge finally spoke. "Mr. Piton, do you have any actual proof that Mrs. Stone was legally enslaved? A bill of sale from the original captives? Documentation of ownership?" Piton faltered. "The auction itself was illegal." The judge's voice was cold. "Slavery has been abolished. Any auction of human beings is not only invalid, but criminal. Mrs. Stone is and always was a free woman. This case is dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Silas swept me into his arms as our friends cheered. Kane's face was purple with rage as he stormed out, Piton trailing behind. "It's over," I whispered against Silas's chest. "It's finally over." But I was wrong. That night, as we celebrated at the cabin with friends, the eastern horizon glowed orange. Smoke rose in the distance. "Fire!" Jim Martinez shouted. "Looks like the Bradley place." The men rode out immediately. I waited with the other women, tending preparations in case of wounded. Hours later, the men returned, faces grim and covered in soot. "Total loss," Silas reported wearily. "Tom and his family are safe, but the house and barn are gone." "Kane?" I asked, though I knew the answer. No proof, but yes. The war had begun in earnest. Over the following weeks, more fires broke out. Horses were stolen or killed. Water sources were poisoned. The territorial authorities seemed powerless or unwilling to intervene. Then came the night I had dreaded. I woke to Silas, shaking my shoulder. "Get dressed, quick." The urgency in his voice had me moving before I was fully awake. Through the window, I saw riders approaching. Many riders. How many? 20. Maybe more. Silas was loading weapons with practiced efficiency. "Too many to fight. Then we run." "No." He pressed a rifle into my hands. "They'll catch us in the open. Our only chance is to make them pay dear for trying." We took position, Silas at the front window, me at the side. The riders stopped just out of easy rifle range. Kane's voice carried on the night air. "Last chance, Stone. Send out the girl and we ride away." "Go to hell," Silas shouted back. "Already been there," Kane replied. "That's where I learned what to do with stubborn fools." The first torch arced through the air, landing on the porch, then another and another. Soon, flames began licking at the dry wood. "They're going to burn us out," I said, my voice remarkably calm. "Maybe, but not without a fight." Silas's first shot took a rider from his saddle. I dropped a horse, sending its rider tumbling. Gunfire erupted from both sides, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like deadly fireflies. The smoke grew thicker. Heat pressed against us. My eyes streamed tears, but I kept shooting, kept fighting. This was our home, our life. I'd die before surrendering it. Then through the chaos came a new sound, hoof beats from the west, lots of them. Federal marshals, drop your weapons. Tom Bradley had succeeded. The cavalry had arrived. Literally, blue uniformed soldiers swept into the yard, surrounding Kane's men. The shooting stopped abruptly. Silas and I stumbled from the burning cabin, coughing but alive. Neighbors formed a bucket brigade, saving most of the structure. In the flickering light, we watched Kane and his men being arrested. Silas Stone, a grizzled marshal, approached. Tom Bradley told me everything. Sorry we didn't get here sooner. You got here when it mattered, Silas said, his arm around me. As dawn broke, we surveyed the damage. The cabin was scorched but standing. The barn had suffered worse but could be rebuilt. Most importantly, we were alive and together. I told you, I said, leaning into my husband's embrace. This is our home. We don't run. Silas kissed the top of my head. No, we don't. We stand and fight together. In the months that followed, we rebuilt not just the structures, but the community. Kane was tried and imprisoned. The land prospered with the water from the spring we'd found. And on the first anniversary of that terrible auction, I stood in my flourishing garden, one hand on my growing belly, the other holding Silas's. No regrets? Silas asked, his eyes full of love. I thought of the journey that had brought me here from the auction block, where I'd tried to flee to this moment of peace and promise. The past was a memory now, a testament to what we had overcome. I was no longer the broken girl who had been auctioned. I was a wild rose, a force of nature, blooming against all odds in the unforgiving desert. The cowboy's bid hadn't made me his forever. Our love had done that. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Our journey here is not one of a typical cowboy love story or a simple Wild West love tale. It is a testament to the idea that even in the most desolate of landscapes, a new path can be forged, and a new life, a new beginning, can be found. This Wild West love story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The legal battles, the physical threats, the emotional toll, all of it was a proving ground, a crucible where our love was tested and hardened into something unbreakable. But the end of one chapter is simply the beginning of another. I looked at Silas, and he looked back at me, a silent understanding passing between us. We had everything we ever wanted here, but there was a whole world out there waiting to be explored. A world of possibility, a world without the ghosts of the past, a world of pure, unadulterated freedom. Our story isn't about settling down. It's about a relentless, healing, and adventurous journey that's just beginning. A journey with a new companion, a new life growing inside me, a new future waiting for us both. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment Amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.